And welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Wednesday, December 5th. I am the host for today's program, Paul DeMain, and many of the stories we read here can be found at our website at IndianCountryNews.com, and here are some of the news stories for the day. The Isanti Riders from Santee, Nebraska left on December 4th on the first leg of their trip to Lower Brule for the Dakota 38 Memorial Ride that will end up in Mankato, Minnesota. The ride was the dream of Jim Miller, a Vietnam veteran from the Cheyenne River Sioux and a descendant of the Dakota who were displaced after the Minnesota Uprising and the hanging of 38 Dakota on December 26, 1862, in what is still the largest mass hanging in U.S. history. The ride concludes at Land of Memories Park in Mankato, Minnesota, on the day after Christmas. The Dakota 38 Memorial Ride from Lower Brule to Mankato is 330 miles long, and participation is expected to be high this year on the 150th anniversary of the original hanging. Another tribal summit in Washington, D.C. with hundreds of tribal leaders has taken place, keeping a presidential promise to meet on a regular basis with tribes across the country and hear them out. Obama was scheduled to speak to tribal leaders the afternoon of December 5th with an update on efforts to strengthen the nation-to-nation relationship emphasized by tribal leaders. In that vein, we speak with Shoshone-Bannock tribal member Mark Trahant from the Shoshone-Bannock Reservation in Fort Hall, Idaho, about what tribes should or could not expect from efforts and negotiations now ongoing in what is called the fiscal cliff, or across-the-board cuts to every single program and department in the United States of about 8%. Just how will that impact Indian country? Mark Trahant, thanks for joining us again for the Native News Update latest and having another conversation here today on the politics of politics and things that are going to impact Indian country. Latest discussion in Washington, D.C. is the fiscal cliff and how that's going to impact programs across the country. But how is that going to impact Indian country?
Well, it's going to impact individual American Indians almost immediately. On January 1st, the payroll tax will go up, and you will notice money out of your paycheck. Second, it's going to impact tribal governments across the board. There's a lot of discussion about the cliff and it's what it'll do to taxes, but there's very little discussion about what it does to budgets. And tribal governments will get hit in several ways on the budget side.
When we talk about those budgets, tell us what we're talking about. Are we talking about every single federal program, the Bureau of Indian Affairs? Let's start there.
Okay. Every program that involves Indians will probably, if the Budget Control Act continues, which is the law of the land at this point, on January 1st, we'll get about an 8.4% budget cut. They've been holding off on any planning for that, so the impact will actually be more than 8%. So it could result in layoffs, it could result in reduction in grants, anything that's not money in hand, like schools often have their money in advance, so they might be okay for a while, but everything else is at risk. One thing I particularly worry about is contract health care, where you have people maybe between stage 3 and stage 4 cancer trying to get outside of the Indian health system. And if there's no money in contract health care, they actually have to wait until they're stage 4 cancer patients to get funding.
That impact is going to be drastic in those particular areas. I mean, if you're saying an 8.5 budget cut, imagine an office that has 100 people, eight or nine of them are going to be gone beginning
Probably
next year.
10. Yeah, probably 10.
No problem.
Because you're talking about on top of everything else and in a shortened time period. So to make up for it, you're actually going to have to hurry up. On top of all that, and this is another issue that I think tribes, is there's a lot of indirect program cuts. For example, one of the things both Republicans and many Democrats are talking about is raising the age of Medicare to 67. That sounds well and good, but the costs for health care from someone 65, 66, 67 is actually lower in Medicare than in almost anywhere else. And if you look at someone in the Indian health system, IHS bills Medicare for those services. So someone 66, that money is suddenly going to have to be absorbed by IHS which means an additional budget burden on that agency.
Right. They not only have to absorb other cuts, but they're taking their own cuts within the Indian Health Service system and taking budget cuts from the Medicare. Is there anything that will be spared on this? Some of the other programs here locally, housing, we've seen a decline in housing starts across Indian country for a number of years. Education, weatherization, fuel assistance. Are any of those programs, are we looking at a possibility of these being phased out yet? We knew under a Republican administration they were actually targeting some departments. Are there going to be some gives and takes in order to save some things to give up other things?
You would hope so, but this Congress is so unintelligent. Who knows what they're going to do? They really are. I mean, the Budget Control Act is the absolute worst example of how to cut government. It's across the board. It doesn't weigh things. It just cuts money. One of the real problems, I think, in this whole debate is that if you look at the budget of the United States, it has a short-term problem and a long-term problem. The short-term problem is fixable. This is not a big deal. It's something that shouldn't be bringing us to the brink of disaster. But we're spending more money than we're taking in, and that's something that you can deal with. The long-term problem is the one that needs to be addressed in a different way, and they're pushing these two together, so they're fighting about the same thing, even though they're two very different issues. Long-term, we have a demographic issue. We have a lot more older people and a lot younger, younger working people, and so that's causing some budget, real serious issues down the road. Unfortunately, in my way of thinking, the way to fix that is to lower healthcare costs. And the best way to do that is to take the Affordable Care Act as a baby step and ratchet it up, start looking for other ways to cut costs. If we solve the healthcare part of this problem, the entire budget deficit goes away, the long-term problem. That's how big a deal it is.
Isn't there other ways that they could perhaps close the gap? We were studying some diagrams last night having to do with the fall of empires, and a lot of the reason empires have fallen in the past is because, including the Soviet Union in the last 2 decades, because of military spending. So much of the money we've fought 2 unfunded wars. We're mostly out of Iraq, but we're not out of Afghanistan yet. What does the impact of the military budget have on the overall system? Is it something that we ought to be shifting our philosophy about being the world's police force?
Right. I mean, you take the defense equation as part of it, and that and the Bush tax cuts would go away January 1st, and that's really largely what drove the deficit the last few years. If we could just get those 2 things under control, the short-term problem would be a lot better shape than it is now. The Budget Control Act hits military spending pretty hard. At least as hard as domestic spending, but probably more because they went through a round of cuts before this point. So a lot of people think that's a good way to start this conversation is let's go ahead and make the defense cuts and kind of realign from there. I remember being in Nicaragua a few years ago, and I was crossing a bridge and ran into a Jeep with a bunch of Canadians in it, and they were talking about how the Jeeps both had Alliance for Progress, the old Kennedy program, stenciled on the back. And they said something to the effect that, yeah, we're riding in an American Jeep, but we're Canadians, but it's different because you're the ones who matter. And so in a sense, the United States plays such a unique role in the world that it can't just give up everything. It has to somehow balance what is the global security needs. I mean, the world is basically, one of the reasons why Europe is different than us is they've given up defense spending and said, let the Americans do it.
Right.
Do that role is a big question.
They didn't have to allocate the money as long as the U.S. was going to do that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
You talked about taxes. One of the conversations had to do with taxes. Is there something that can be learned from where tribal governments are in the tax situation? I mean, there's actually not a lot of taxes on a lot of reservations. And is that a positive or a negative when we get into our communities?
Well, I think right now it's a negative because you're looking at, with the sequestration, all of the numbers will be negatives. They will be taking money away from tribes without adding anything, whereas state governments, to compare, if sequestration goes into effect, if the fiscal cliff we drive off, they actually get some money coming in because all these tax loopholes suddenly go away and the states can start collecting that. So they actually get some plus signs as well as minus signs, whereas tribes don't have that. We're looking at a new way of taxing that needs to be a part of the conversation. For example, windmills are going in a lot of parts of the country in really big ways. And windmills require property taxes, which is a real problem on reservations because of the status of land. But it's really the only way governments get any resources out of them. States that have good, sound structures for collecting long-term from those windmills actually do pretty well. Colorado is a good example, where other states just let them build them and go, and they don't collect anything. I think tribes need to figure out how to get something out of it.
And we're looking at that whole variety of taxes, from property taxes, income taxes, sales taxes as methods. Are you aware of any tribes that have begun to adopt those kinds of taxing codes and applying them to tribal and non-tribal members?
There's been some limited experiments with sales taxes. There's a lot of tribes that have hotel and occupancy taxes. That's really a growing one. Almost every tribe has some form of tobacco tax, gasoline tax, often up to the state limits or comparable to the state limits. So there's some things going on. Income tax would be interesting because if you started an income tax at say, $50,000 a year on the reservation, you're not going to tax that many people. But those who are earning more than that, I'm sure, are in a situation where it'd be good for them to pay.
Affordability. So there are people who can afford to participate in payment of taxes or co-pay in some cases.
Right. Where I live, I don't pay state taxes. So if an income tax that started at $50,000 and up, I'd be more than happy to contribute to the tribe because government has to be funded. I mean, it's the way it is.
Lots of people in Indian country have a hard time voting because they don't feel that counts. And we turn them out to vote, and it gets to that point where a lot of us feel as individuals we have very little influence on what's happening in the White House. For example, you got some good ideas there, but will they ever filter up to the people who are making the decisions? Does Indian country, and there's a tribal summit going on in Washington, D.C. right now, is that going to be heard? Is that going to have any impact on anything going on in Congress and the Senate?
In the margins, I think there are folks that will go out of their way to protect the BIA budget, but as we've discussed, it's way more complicated than that. One of the conversations I think we need to have with Indian country, to be honest, is that we have a structural constitutional problem that limits our power. And not just Indians, but virtually every poor group in America. And unlike the rest of the world, when somebody wins an election because of these constitutional barriers, they can't actually affect change the way they would like to. Look at the United States Senate. California has 33 million people, in Wyoming less than 1 million, yet they have the same authority in the Senate. That single thing makes it an unfair enterprise. You add on that the requirement for a supermajority, which makes someone from Wyoming even more powerful, and it's a recipe for ineffective government. I think we're reaching the point where we really need to think through, are we governing the way that works best for a country of 300 million?
Indeed. It seems like despite the fact that everyone tries to call for the end of the divisiveness, the country ends up being more and more divided all the time. In fact, there's people talking about seceding from the United States, and then the tribes can secede from whatever country they form, I guess, kind of a thing.
Well, I mean, look at the language in the last few days. People in the House are saying, well, we want a mandate too. We won the election. And people reelected the House of Representatives. That's true, but what they're not saying is that the deck is so stacked that almost every member running for Congress wins re-election.
Right.
It's not a fair fight, whereas at least the presidency is across the country and represents the entire thinking of the country. If those same congressional elections were state by state, where, say, Wisconsin had 11 seats or whatever it is, they had 11 at-large representatives, that would be a different representative body.
Well, that's interesting. We'll keep an eye on it and see what happens. What's the date on this? And will the fiscal cliff be resolved before December 21st when the Mayan calendar comes to an end? Or
I heard that was a whole plot just to count down the movie to the beginning of The Hobbit.
could be. We'll keep in touch with you.
I think they will reach a deal, but I'm not sure it's a deal any of us are going to like.
Yeah, I agree. We'll keep in touch on you. We'll talk about it when we see something develop, and maybe they will come up with a great plan that we'll all enjoy.
Okay.
Thanks, Mark.
See ya.
And that is another roundup of news from Indian Country. On this edition of the Native News Update, we want to say Wawanan for joining with us, and come back again soon.